Welcome to another edition of the Hawk Off the Press podcast. I'm your host, Gazette Hawkeyes reporter John Steppe. I'm excited to be joined by Scott Brickman, the NIL general manager for the University of Iowa through a partnership with Altius. Scott, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you having me. And as we discussed, exciting times.
Yes. So first of all, for the person listening who maybe understands collectives, maybe doesn't, who maybe understands typical other NIL activity, how do you kind of explain what your role is like as the NIL general manager?
Well, first of all, I wish I could explain what NIL is, and I can't even. I'm supposed to be the expert in the field, and it is a ever-changing, almost daily space within college athletics. So within my role itself with Altius Sports Partners, again, a little bit of background as a former coach, and then came into athletic development, the fundraising for Iowa. And then, as you know, with Brad Heinrichs and Jane Oswald, helped get the collective off the ground. And then back in December, Beth Guest, our director of athletics, created this position in-house here with Iowa through Altius Sports Partners, which is a third-party consultant, kind of the leading expert across the country. So Altius has about 45 Division I schools that it's partnered with right now, and most of them are getting our Power 5 schools. And my position is one of 18 across the country. So there's 18 general managers, which essentially means a general manager is in-house in the athletic department. It's boots on the ground for the athlete, the coaches, the staffs, etc. And so if you think of it over the course of, there's about 300 plus Division I schools, and Iowa's one of 18 that actually have a general manager on campus for everyone to have access to. I think it really shares and shows how important NIL is to our coaches, our staff, our athletes here at Iowa. And so what my day might look like, again, there's a lot to it. I wake up every day knowing I need to expect the unexpected, because that's just the reality of college athletics right now. A simple day or a day for me could be really with the athletes. Each athlete will have team sessions. So I have Aaron Holland and Ty Dennis. So they are two Altius colleagues of mine. They work remote. One's in Georgia, one's in Minnesota. But they're working with me on a daily basis to help me with the national landscape, so to speak. So with the athlete aspect of it, it'll be team sessions, educating them. And there's like 13 different areas of education that we can hit on in a team session. But more importantly, the one-on-one session. So each athlete knows from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, I'm here every day, and I can walk them through that process, NIL process, from beginning to end. And what does that look like? Beginning with, I'll have an athlete come in and how do I even reach out to a CEO of a business or brand? Like they just having that initial outreach. Another consideration, an athlete, and I'll ask them is, what kind of brands do you align yourself? What do you think of yourself as? Or do you want to be a future farmer? Do you want to be a doctor, lawyer, etc.? But one thing I always mention to the athletes is, remember that the internet doesn't erase itself. So whoever you choose to brand with and align with today, you need to be comfortable that 20 years from now, it's still going to be out there, right? And so just walking through, have them kind of critically think through that instead of just jumping at the first opportunity that presents itself from a compensation standpoint, really thinking through who are they, what is their identity, what are their passions in life. So those are kind of more of the one-on-one sessions. And then for myself as well, coaches, staff, they're always dropping in. Coaches, it's roster management. What's that going to look like? What their NIL budget might be? How can we increase that? And probably most importantly, from the dollar sense, is having these collaborational type meetings. We have them monthly with the kind of the three revenue streams that we have here that can support NIL. So you have obviously Altius. I'll take incoming business requests and disseminate those to our athletes. But you have Hawkeye Sports Properties, which is our Learfield third party that does our corporate sponsors. They're now actively in the NIL space and bringing in corporate dollars to have businesses partner up for NIL deals with some of our Iowa athletes. And then probably most recent, because the NCAA rules and guidelines and with this court case, everybody's been reading about the house case. We're now actively trying to have conversations with our UICA, so our foundation, and having their athletic development team be more proactive in conversations with our individual donors. And so that's one of the priorities is NIL for all the reasons we just kind of discussed. And so if there's an individual that has an interest, the money still has to go through the Swarm Collective at this time. And potentially in the future that will change. But just again, putting NIL out there from a revenue generation standpoint, and those are kind of the three areas that can generate the revenue for NIL. And that's again, Hawkeye Sports Properties. You got the Swarm Collective doing their piece of it, and now trying to get our athletic development to be more proactive in that space as well.
What does that kind of collaboration look like between you and the Swarm? Obviously, as you're mentioning, quite familiar with them from your time working for them as I think you were the COO, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that's the beauty of it. I will say this. We absolutely don't raise the most money in the country, the NIL and in the Swarm Collective. And Brad's been out there and has made that pretty public, but I don't know if there's a more well-run collective in the country. And I can say that having been in that. And then now in my current position, listening to all the internal conversations, arguments, disagreements of other institutions. I mentioned the 43 different institutions that we're partners with. So I get to hear that perspective. There aren't many and very, very few across the country that have a relationship that we currently have with Beth and Matt Henderson, with our collective. And then obviously from that standpoint, how that looks like for myself is I'll meet with them about every week, if not multiple times a week. And so again, they are the driver right now that has to take incoming revenue from contributions or donations from members, and from our donor base, so to speak. And so they are short. They're very lean, as Brad has said to you over there. It's Brad and Jane Oswald and a few different interns that have been extremely helpful for the collective. But trying to help navigate when I have a previous donor relationship, and they have interest in supporting NIL, that reach out, have that relationship with them and be able just to kind of pass them along at the back end to help close the gift. Like that's been very, very beneficial for us just to have that built-in relationship with the collective, with the Swarm, because very few do have that. And I even can look across the Big Ten. There's some high-level name brands within the Big Ten that have had their collectives fold up, and they've had to start over multiple times just because there hasn't been the right people leading the mission. So we're very fortunate in that relationship.
And then kind of outside the collective activity, what does kind of day to day, the standard, for probably lack of a better word, this kind of standard NIL deal look like for an athlete at Iowa?
Yeah, you gave me a loaded question on that one. No, it really, honestly, this is the truth. It all depends on who the athlete is, right? And I'll name some things that to begin with, what our athletes need to consider. And one thing in the education piece of it, for example, most athletes, give or take, have about 90 minutes a day of free time. So each individual within each sport, there's a monetary value of that so-called 90 minutes, right? And so each individual needs to figure out what that is. And so some individuals for that 90 minutes will charge or ask a business for a higher compensation amount than others. And so that differs from athlete to athlete, but also differs from sport to sport. So I'm not circling around and trying to avoid your question, but there are some businesses that obviously understand the ROI on this. And an example I can give you on that is we recently had a women's basketball player show up at a car dealership, and her name was not Caitlin Clark, so it was another athlete within women's basketball. And end of the day, she made a 2-hour appearance, and almost 300 people showed up at that car dealership. And as the owner explains it, it would have taken him weeks to have 300 people show up at his car dealership. So for him, whether he can convert that to sales or not, To be determined on that. Time will tell. But that is an ROI for a business that, in this case, that business has identified an athlete who drew or brought in traffic, so to speak, foot traffic, that what he ended up compensating the athlete, it'll far pay for itself when it comes to, hopefully selling more vehicles, so to speak. So that's just a kind of a small example of how businesses are utilizing our athletes. I will say this, like, excuse me, early on, that a lot of businesses really did not want to get involved in NIL, and rightfully so. Um, there's a lot of stuff out there that is not accurate. That's probably the simplest way to put it, right? So what businesses have started to figure out and trying to be creative with them and innovative, so to speak, is that the fact is every one of these businesses as a CEO. So John, you have your own business, you're running it. You have a marketing line item budget, whatever that line item number is, so to speak. And in the past, you've used it for maybe a radio ad, a TV commercial, maybe you put a billboard up on I-380 between Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. Well, now you have another opportunity for that marketing budget to align it with and help with partnering with a University of Iowa student athlete, right? So in essence, if you're Hawkeye, it's a win-win. Like hopefully you work through the process where the ROI is significant and it helps your business, but also now you're able to help and impact an Iowa athlete in the NIL space, which in a bigger picture, it helps retain our athletes here. It helps our coaches continue to put championship level teams on the field for our fans to be a part of each and every year. So it's a small thing, but it branches out into a very, very big, if you look at it that way, as far as the impact it can make. And so I think that in an indirect way, it's been the biggest change in NIL in the last here at Iowa in the last 12 months or so has been the openness of our businesses now to understand they have another outlet here. And that's our Iowa student athletes to help their business as well.
And then you were mentioning kind of the misconceptions that are around NIL. Is there one kind of misconception in particular that you're kind of consistently trying to kind of correct people on?
Yeah, I think the big one is what we all know, and it's what we're all trying to figure out, right? Is these numbers that you're hearing nationally right now for men's basketball, probably most importantly men's basketball, uh, they're just not accurate, right? And so that's the one thing I do have access to with our Altius sports partners. Their party group is, again, we're working with 43 different institutions. Again, we're not disclosing who those institutions are, but we do have a database. We know what those numbers look like. We know what the budget numbers look like at a school in the Big East, a school in the Big 12, Big 10, et cetera. So what's happened, and this is my opinion, is a lot of the agents are now being involved in this space, right? And what's their job to do? Their job is to make the most money for their athletes that they're working on behalf of. So you get a lot of numbers thrown out there. They always, as you can imagine, are very, very high in that process. And right now, our collectives can negotiate with these agents on behalf. So, which is a whole nother conversation for another day, another time. But that's where we're at right now. And so those numbers, the budgets, yes, there are one-offs, and you read about those. The quarterback from Tennessee at 7 or 8 million, and maybe KU has someone that comes in on the basketball side, and so you do have these outliers. But overall, the general numbers that you and everyone else is reading about, I don't have a number to quantify it, but they're inaccurate and they're higher than what is actually happening on the ground.
So we can stay in hypothetical here, but hypothetically, if you hear like a $500,000 number for a point guard, is that accurate or is that maybe an inflated number?
Yeah, I mean, I can't probably answer that, in the sense of the easiest way to answer that is the market's going to drive it, right? So if you have an institution, an athletic, excuse me, a men's basketball team that really, really needs a five or a big or a point guard, and their collective or their NIL is willing to to spend that, then again, it's market driven. And that's where I think we're not there today. But there's even a recent report this morning, excuse me, with allergies, that we have a third party out there that's trying to now create their own um, market value system as we get into this revenue share, so to speak, putting a value on each athlete. Again, I question at this point in time how accurate that's going to be. But to answer your question, yeah, that there certainly probably is and are um, certain men's basketball players, for example, as you mentioned, that are getting 500,000. But again, um, where that's at, what institutions, again, it really is supply and demand, right? So if you're demanding, I really need as a coach, you're thinking as a coach, I need a point guard. Well, and then the other thing that plays into that I think will also change in the beginning part was our coaches were really concerned with the locker room, right? And so that's a big part of it. Retainment of players, current players that have been there, done that, they've performed at a high level, and then you have this potential transfer portal individual coming in, and are you going to provide more compensation for them just to be a part of it? Like, that's the one thing I think, like, at least our coaches have understood or are doing a really, really high level job of understanding, like, they have some really good people here, uh, players, student athletes that are performing at a high level, but they're also really, really good off the field, off the court, in the classroom, etc. And as you can tell by the numbers, if you dig into it, our retainment of athletes that our coaches want to retain, whether it's a fifth year or a COVID year, etc., like, we're executing at a pretty high level, which is in essence, you look at what our coaches are in a transfer portal, how many athletes do we have in the portal versus you name the school, so to speak. We're way less than that. But a lot of that has to do with the culture that our coaches have established. Our athletes want to be here. And in fact, if they can delay, some athletes, if they can delay having to get a real job for a year and maybe play one more year and have an opportunity for NIL on top of it, like, those are win-wins. And our coaches have executed at a really high level in that space.
With that retention, what does that look like for you? Are you like constantly running around like the week after a season, or kind of what role do you play,
Yeah.
does Brad play kind of in that whole process?
Yeah, the transfer portal is different for each of us. So Brad, obviously, the way that's set up right now with the rules and regulations, like, we both will talk to the agents, but for different purposes, right? And so if my role with the agents is just having them understand. So if they're calling on behalf of an athlete, how does NIL work? How has it worked in the past? And we walk through how the swarm operates, because that's the way we have to function at this current time. But walking through that with them, contracts, what they're going to look like, and not monetarily, but are they exclusive? Are they multi-year? And so some of those things are conversations that the agents might ask. And what I've always educated or tried to educate our athletes is, if you're going to bet on yourself, we try to shy away or recommend maybe shying away from exclusive deals or multi-year deals. Say you're a freshman here at Iowa, you started on your team, whatever you name the sport, and you might have an agent or a business that wants to lock you down for X amount of compensation for the next 3 years. Well, if you're an athlete betting on yourself, you would think as you progress year to year that the value, the market, your brand, the market for that should increase. And so those are kind of some of the conversations that, again, I won't make that decision for the athletes, but those are conversations we'll have and make them at least critically think about before they sign off on that contract. So, yeah, so the portal, again, as I mentioned, we don't have a lot of transfers compared to other schools. Like, I think back to Colorado football a year ago when they had whatever the number was. Like, I can't imagine what that looked like. But we did. We had men's, women's basketball, and football all opened up at the same time. So you do have a lot of incoming coming in. And even agents from of our current athletes, right? Just want to understand, okay, as we navigate this new era in college athletics, what's this going to look like? What does it look like from an NIL budget standpoint, et cetera? So there's just a lot of questions with not a lot of answers at this time. But that's kind of like look at it from a holistic view. myself and my role from the Altius standpoint and what the collective does, we're still having the conversations with the athletes and potentially a lot of agents as well. And that's becoming more and more commonplace in the NIL. But the reasons in our conversations are completely different than what the collective would have.
And then how do you kind of navigate this space when it seems like this kind of NIL environment seems to change so frequently, whether it's the court case or whatever, in terms of you don't really seem to have a lot of NIL enforcement, and with things changing, how much or how do you navigate that?
Yeah, great question. Again, I could go back to expect the unexpected. So each and every day, yeah, I pride myself in having an organization. So I had, you have your calendar, right? And each and every day, it never ever goes the way it's supposed to go, right? So you'll have drop-ins from, again, coach comes in, they heard something on the road recruiting this this school or this men's basketball department has X amount, or they're offering this, right? So we talk about roster management. We might talk about what can a budget look like going forward for NIL. Again, having some previous experience fundraising, have a pretty good indication and relationships with some of our donors, and whether they choose to operate in the NIL space right now or currently or in the future is to be determined. But if you're not adaptable, and I think that goes with anybody, coaches, staff, like you have to be adaptable and flexible because things are changing so quickly in this space right now. I think, I've tried to put myself in a position of thinking what Beth has to think of as a director of athletics. And, I don't want to go into too far, but the revenue share and what that's going to look like. And then what does that mean for NIL? Is it, the collectives? I mean, those are all questions that need to be answered. We don't have answers right now. And so to get locked in to a way of doing things, maybe how they were in the past, like you're wasting time and energy doing that because that's not coming back. We're moving forward. And again, we don't know what that's going to look like, but I do potentially see like NIL being a supplement to whatever the rev share is. And again, I don't know what the logistics are going to look like, but I don't think true NIL, where a business wants to utilize a student athlete for marketing purposes for their business, that's still going to be there in some shape or form. So I think we have some clarity on some of that. But again, how this is going to get rolled out, it could be 3 months, it could be 6, it could be 18. I think the identified date is kind of the August 1st, 2025, when this will essentially go live. Between now and then, there's a lot to figure out.
How, granted, this is so fresh, but how much have you been able to? I'm assuming you have had some discussions either within Iowa or within your other Altius colleagues in terms of what you could possibly be doing on August 1st, 2025.
To answer your question, I really don't have an answer because I honestly have no idea what my role is going to look like. And I can share that because since I started in December, the priorities within Iowa for my position have changed in 4 to 5 months, right? And so nothing that is changed or become not a priority, so to speak, but the education piece. So again, there's so much I need to do on the education piece with our student athletes, our coaches, and our staff. But an example of that in February when we went out and met with 5 or 6 of our teams, right? And kind of give them the NIL 101 education. Well, some of that stuff that I presented 2 to 3 months ago is already outdated. So again, having to circle back now with that team at the appropriate time and update them. And oh, by the way, what I shared with you 3 or 4 months ago isn't even valid anymore. So like that's the hard part. Like you're constantly, and this is the way it's going to be, you're constantly spinning your wheels trying to catch up on, again, not monthly, not weekly, but almost a daily news cycle of NIL. I mean, you're reading the same thing that we're all reading. Some of those meetings we're in, etc. But no one's hiding anything right now. Like we're literally just sitting here waiting for the courts to decide what this is going to look like. You got, the plaintiffs, defendants, but then on top of that, how do you navigate the fact that potentially some of these things in the settlement are going to lead to future lawsuits, right? And without going into details of that, there's some things in my mind that, um, depends on how the rev share gets disseminated, like potentially more lawsuits coming. So just again, you try to stay in the moment. Again, you hear that all the time. I don't think you can get too far ahead of yourself in this space, in the NIL space right now, just because of the fact all the stuff I just described, like it changes so quickly. And so how do I navigate that? Again, I just go back to just being, you have to be flexible. It's not a great feeling. There's some uneasiness every day when you wake up because you just don't know what the next shoe is going to happen, when it's going to drop. And so what my role is going to look like 18 months, I have no idea. I wish I did. It would help me feel better about it. But at the end of the day, like you just keep pushing forward, keep doing what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, it's not about what my position is going to look like or even our coaches and staff. We're trying to do what we can do to position our student athletes, to have the best experience they possibly can at Iowa. And NIL is going to be a part of that equation moving forward.
And then as you talk to your colleagues from other departments, are you able to get a sense of, okay, Iowa's top 5 or top 8 or whatever kind of within the Big Ten, or is it kind of too murky to be able to kind of definitively claim that?
Yes and no. Again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I do have access a little bit with through Altius of what I would say more the men's basketball budget, because that's kind of been the one that's been the most skewed and has been probably the most inaccurate across the country from a media perspective. Um, from that standpoint, I, I don't want to label us yes or no. Like it changes quickly, but we are, in the top third, and it depends on what sport, right? So eat some sports here at Iowa, when they talk to recruits or prospects, NIL is really not a conversation they're having, right? In other sports, men's basketball, women's football, like again, it's maybe not the first question that's coming out of a prospect's mouth when they're having conversation with the coaches, but it is a conversation piece. And so the priority is a lot more. So again, are we up? You name the brand in the Big Ten, that historically has been really, really good in football, et cetera. Like we're not there, probably from a financial standpoint, but our coaches for decades now have never been probably on an even playing field with those institutions, with those brands I'm referring to, and we've done pretty well for ourselves. So the beauty of it here at Iowa is our coaches have never felt like they have to have the most. If they can be in the ballpark and who they are, the culture they develop, they know they're going to have a shot to win a championship year in and year out. Will they get that done? There's a lot of luck involved in that as well. But this giving our coaches, our athletes, an opportunity to win those championships. And so for us, being in the top third, whatever that looks like, whatever the definition is, we're in a pretty good place. And can we do more? Certainly, and we will continue to do more as we continue to evolve in this space. But I think more importantly is for us, for our coaches, our staff, you got the collective, you have myself now as kind of the GM that has, touch points with everyone we kind of discussed on this call today. It's just being on one page and that communication and continue to communicate at a very transparent and high level. So we're not stepping on each other's toes. At the end of the day, whether you're a coach for the rowing, whether you're a coach for baseball or football, like we're all rooting for each other. We just don't know what it's going to look like, and that again, as a coach, you're going to fight for your own individual sport program. But at the end of the day, we want us as Hawkeyes to continue to be champions, and we'll get there, John. I just don't, I don't have those answers, and it's uneasy, but it's reality. And when you're in college sports, as long as I have, like you understand, like this is the world we live in.
For someone with kind of the diverse array of experiences like you have in terms of in coaching, in development, in NIL now in a couple different facets, could you have predicted that your own career journey would kind of go this way?
Not a chance. Not a chance. So baseball, did that for 18 years. And I made a transition to, the administrative side. So doing the fundraising for the athletic department. When I made that transition back in 2017, what you and I have discussed for the last half hour wasn't even on typically it wasn't even on the radar for the most part, right? So NIL, rev share for sure, like, the courts in the past had kind of shot that down as far as the revenue share. And so here we are, fast forward, whatever it's been 15 years later or more, actually been more than that. We're in this spot right now where it's real. And so I think back to athletic development, fundraising for athletics, and then Brad Heinrichs and whatever it was, June 2022. Him taking the initiative to get something going because we were a year behind on the collective space, right? So July 2021 was when everything went live with NIL, and here we were a year into it, and there was nothing here at Iowa. So fortunately for Brad, he took the ownership, the initiative to get this thing off the ground. Again, fast forward, Jane and myself joined him. It really worked well because you have a extremely successful business leader in Brad. My background being in fundraising, Jane was doing the event, so I felt like we were in a really good spot. We could always do more, and we will continue to strive to do more. But some of the things I thought I knew, it's just, as when you're doing a startup business, there's a lot of learning, and that's what essentially the Swarm Collective was. Like, we're starting this up, trying to get a 501c3 status through the IRS. Well, we did that, but we didn't have the right classification. So we had to reclassify ourselves so we could actually take on family foundations and donor advised funds, et cetera. So, this little thing, that's an example one of many things that we learned on the fly. Most of that was on the fly for us. Like, every day is, it was something different. Our conversation with Brad and Jane, and then again, when I was with them, like that, I just felt like that was going to be the norm. That this is what it's going to be. And now here we are. I was with them about 15 to 16 months, and now this, we're bringing a GM in house. We were one of the first in the country to do that. But this now we're having discussions on revenue sharing, right? In addition to NIL. And so, no, there's no way on my radar that I ever thought we would be at this, especially in the time that we're here, right? So everything has been really pushed fast forward. Things typically don't move that fast at the NCAA level. Like, we're dinosaurs in the NCAA level most of the time. So to have something really progress at the speed it's going through right now, it's actually pretty fascinating to be a part of.
Back in 2022, when you've worked for the university for a long time, then you have a startup with startup risk. What kind of pushed you over the edge to take that leap of faith and join the collective?
So don't ask my wife. So there was certainly some risk to that because you're going into a startup. Startups are never risk averse. But as a former coach, I felt like I was fairly aggressive. I love challenges, right? And trying to put everything together to make it work at the most efficient level you possibly can. And so I think I was ready for a new challenge. This was certainly it. Again, as I just mentioned, had no clue, no idea. It certainly wasn't as simple as I think Brad and Jane and I thought it was going to be. And again, Brad will still say we're not where we need to be at, and I agree, and we'll continue to do that and strive to get to that point. But at the end of the day, like it's just I think you have to have someone that again is willing to take on the risk, like you mentioned, but also for the betterment of our athletes. Like, again, I'm still in college athletics. I was able to do something or be a part of something that was new, is innovative, is creative. Again, we didn't have all the answers. We were making multiple mistakes weekly on the Swarm side of it as we tried to get up to speed, what we can and can't do. There were extremely a lot of limitations what the collectives could do from a communication standpoint, even with staff and coaches. Well, that has been eliminated. So it's helped that process of it. So navigating a startup with the collective, but also understanding there are still NCAA rules and bylaws, having a relationship with our compliance office, understanding what we can and can't do. It certainly was an undertaking. I give Brad a ton of credit for that because he didn't need to do that. But we are in a tremendous spot here at Iowa because of that, and because of the swarm as it stands today. And so that's just a little bit, yeah, of kind of why I chose to do it. And the same thing with the GM. That this GM position didn't really. I had an idea what it was going to look like from the beginning, but as I mentioned, those priorities have completely shifted, and it's turned into more of a rev generation position where working with Learfield, working on Hawkeye Sports Properties, they get the corporate sponsors, but also kind of in a way working with some of the competitors of those of our third party, uh, Hawkeye Sports Properties. So example is if you have a grain bin of some sort that's in the farming segment, so to speak, and there's a competitor. Well, if we can help the Hawkeyes, let's see if we can have two different partnerships, right? One from the corporate sponsor and then also have one for the NIL. So those are the things that I think we've really just started to work into as my role, what it's going to look like. Again, it's more of a still education for coaches, athletes, and staff, but also, again, as I mentioned, the revenue generation, like we need to continue to push and plow forward on that.
And maybe this is a premature question, but kind of down the road, long term for you and your career, do you see NIL as kind of a permanent thing for you, or do you see this as kind of a phase as you go through this wave of college athletics, or kind of what does your own outlook look like?
I think with anything, the more diverse you can have, the more diversity you can have, the experiences, as I just mentioned. Um, it's almost laughable. I still have notes in a book of the swarm, just as we our day-to-day meetings and looking back at what you didn't know then that you know now. It's like, you spent a week on a conversation on something that was irrelevant, right? Like it's at least it's irrelevant now, but at the time it didn't seem like it was irrelevant. So just having those experiences, I think, across the board, whether it's fundraising with the athletic development, obviously the coach's standpoint is, a majority of my time was spent in that space, but then also, yeah, being part of the startup of the Iowa Swarm Collective, and now in my space now, where I want to go. I mean, I try not to think that far ahead. My aspirations is to continue to grow in this space. If it's to elevate, and maybe hopefully it's here at Iowa, but if it's elsewhere, then those are things I don't plan out, so to speak. I'm open to those opportunities, but it's more for me of it continuing to grow, what kind of impact I can make on our coaches staff here at Iowa while I'm here at Iowa. So again, to answer your question with the NIL, like I don't even know what NIL is going to look like a year or two from now, let alone 5 years. So to try to project what that's going to look like for myself, I just tried to get myself in the moment, working through what we're working through on a daily basis. Everything else from a professional standpoint will eventually, if it's meant to be, will take care of itself.
And then one last question, if you could change one thing about NIL, what would it be?
One,
Or
yeah,
two?
or two, or how about, yeah. So short thought process on this. I would tell you this, like all of us, I think, really wanted NIL to be what NIL was supposed to be, right? And you think of Caitlin Clark, let's just use her for an example. She took nothing, did nothing with the Swarm Collective, right? Her compensation from NIL was directly from corporate business sponsors, right? So again, we've all seen the commercials, but there's even other ones that aren't out there as much on the TV. That's what NIL was supposed to be. And if you think back, excuse me, think back to 2021, when she was a freshman, I believe, she couldn't have taken a dime for anything she did, right? And then I think most recently I saw something out there in media that the economic impact of Caitlin and her women's basketball is over $80 million, right? So you're talking about restaurants, hotels, you name it, right? So to think back 3 years ago, for her to and the women's basketball to have that kind of impact on the community and not be compensated, like it in the moment it didn't make sense because that's what it was, right? But you think back now and it's just that that ain't fair, right? And so that's the thing that I think our donor base, our business partners have really started to understand, like this isn't this is an opportunity for them to jump into this space. And I kind of shared with you the example of the billboard and the radio ad, so to speak. And so this is what NIL is supposed to be. And what I appreciate is our businesses throughout Iowa, but also nationally. Like we'll have a CEO from a business. He's an Iowa alum, but he's out in LA, and he'll reach out. How can I partner? How can I help the Hawks? And so that's what the one thing I wish NIL was from the get-go was what we consider true NIL. And there's a lot of other different, yeah, you said one or two. I mean, I could go on a laundry list. I mean, let's just be honest, like there's the tampering part of it, right? And so we had probably been part of some of that, obviously on the, where other institutions, because it's legal right now. The collectives, if they want to, and we're not at Iowa advocating or doing or having Brad or the Swarm do any of this, but it doesn't stop any other collective from reaching out to one of our current athletes from you name the institution or the brand and reach out to our athlete and say, hey, do you have interest and get into the portal? Like they can actually negotiate the way it is today without the settlement being enforced, et cetera. Like everything has opened up. And I think we all kind of felt like it would come back a little bit the other way. And in fact, it's gone the other way where it's open season, right? And you've heard the coaches talk about that. Like you have the transfer portals, you can transfer as many times as you want. You can go in, you can come back out. I think that pendulum swung completely to the opposite side. Whether it stays there or moves back to the middle, I don't know. But I think from an NIL perspective, I think we'll get to the point where NIL is true NIL. And I think that's all our coaches and staff can really ask for, is to have it be what we all intended it to be, I think, when it began. And it's not that at the moment.
Well, Scott, thanks for joining me.
John, I appreciate it. Anytime. Hopefully we can come back another time. And at that time, I hope we have a few more answers on what the future is going to be in college athletics. So I appreciate the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into another episode. Until next time, we will talk Hawks later.